You're tuned into the Unnecessary Harm podcast, where we drill down on issues of substance use and its cultural impact. Your host, Shane Barco, Executive Director of the Delgado Institute, with over 40 years experience in youth and community work and a passion for building resilience.
Hey, welcome back to the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Good to have you here with us again. And for those chiming in for the first time, welcome on board as always. Love to have new listeners and new subscribers. We're seeing that added as we go along. It's a great opportunity to spend time with some quality people today, and one of those guests is quite remarkable. Today's guest doesn't just talk about drug policy. She tracks it, analyses it, testifies on it, and mobilises coalitions to change it. She represents a key policy engine behind demand reduction, which is something that we're very much into and near and dear to our heart. Where others advocate, she legislates. Where others educate, she mobilises coalitions. With over 16 years coordinating grassroots campaigns to defeat legalization efforts and shape sound drug policy, she connects the dots between community advocacy, legislative action, and real-world outcomes. Her leadership of the World Federation Against Drug positions her as a global voice against the normalisation of drug use, particularly around marijuana legalization and, of course, the emerging synthetic drug crisis. Amy is the Executive Director of Drug Free America Foundation and Save Our Society from Drugs, where she monitors over 400 pieces of drug legislation every year and coordinates grassroots campaigns to push back against legalisation efforts. Being the international president of the World Federation Against Drugs, she is leading a global movement of nearly 500 NGOs to prioritise prevention, treatment, and recovery over normalisation and profit. And the Delgado Institute is very proud to be a member of that movement. From her early work in adult drug court to her current role shaping policy on the world stage, Amy brings a strategic, evidence-driven voice to one of the most contentious debates in public health today. Amy Ronshausen, welcome to the Unnecessary Harm podcast.
Thank you for having me. That's quite a build-up. I'm excited to hear from this lady.
I was thinking to myself, that's a lot of gravy, but it's a very big potato, so I have no problem with that. It's great to have you here, and that's a very accurate rendition of who you are and how you operate. So it's good to have you here. And the conversation today is going to go down a few places, which I'm quite excited about. And for our listeners, particularly many people that listen and chime into what we do here based on story, narrative, people's experiences, which is great. But we very much as an organisation, as an institute, to focus on policy, legislation, and a lot of the stuff that really matters when it comes to shifting culture away from substance use and the harms that it inevitably creates. So having you on in this context as a real world operator as well as a policy expert is something that's really quite good. Excited about that. But look, to get our listeners a little bit more acquainted with you, and many listening again as usual globally, that will know you very well and acquainted with you, which is fantastic. But many don't, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere. Many won't be familiar with you. And so it's good to get a little bit of insight into how you tick, some of your history and whatnot. So let's kick off with some of the core drivers. You obviously started about 16, 17 years ago in this space, and you've sort of chimed in on the war for drugs and pushing back against it. So what were some of the core drivers for you? I mean, going way back at the start, and obviously drug courts, we'll talk about that a bit later on. So what were some of the drivers for you getting involved in this space?
So it actually kind of unfolded very, uneventfully. It wasn't something that I went to school for. I actually have a degree in humanities. So nothing really, unless you want to play a really mean game of Trivial Pursuit, there's not a lot I can do with that degree. And I just kind of fell into a job at one of our local treatment centers, one of the largest treatment centers here in the county that I live in. And I started working in their call center. So this is where people called to get help. And you could connect them with services, you could connect them with outside resources outside of the organization that I was working for. And so I just kind of learned a lot about the system and how the system operates. And as when I grew up, I grew up in a wonderful home. I have a wonderful family, both parents. I've got a great sister, and she had some substance abuse issues as she was growing up in her early teens. She's my younger sister. And so when I first started in this field, I always tell people I came in as an advocate for people like my parents who didn't know where to turn. They didn't have any resources. They were very naive about the world of substance use and the world of drugs. They didn't use drugs. They didn't really know people that use drugs, so they didn't know where to turn to for help. And, this was 30 something, 35 years ago. There wasn't a lot of places to go, and there was still, we think about the stigma that's associated with seeking help now. Imagine that 35 years ago.
Yeah.
It was just,
Okay.
even worse. And
Sure.
here we were, this church going family. And, like this was something that, shouldn't have happened to us, I think is what my parents probably thought. And so when I first started in this field, it really was to advocate for those parents who didn't know where to turn to, that weren't sure what to do. But as I stayed in this field, I really understood that, I kind of had a chip on my shoulder, to be honest, growing up with my younger sister, who in my mind chose those behaviors over her family.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
because, I was a teenager, I didn't understand substance abuse and addiction. And so as I've grown in this field, I've learned that, some of those choices weren't hers. She didn't have an option in some of those things. And I realized how that, you know, uh, impacted her cognitively and behaviorally. And it really kind of shifted my focus on, not only being there for people like my parents, but being there for people like my sister and making sure that they had other opportunities that the community made available for them, so they didn't feel that that was a path that they had to go down, whether it be from depression or anxiety or just, seeking a different thrill, making sure there were things available. And then, once that person is on that path, what resources are available to them? Because as a family, we didn't know how to support my sister.
Of course.
And looking back, we probably did a very poor job of that. Um, but thankfully, my sister is, alive and well and has two wonderful children who are grown now. One's in college and
Beautiful.
one is
Beautiful.
in the mid-20s. And my sister has a job and, she's engaged and, lives a great life. And so we were very fortunate there because we know too many families who that's not the way the story has worked out for. So in the many years I've been in this field, my reason for staying has changed. But the one thing that I think has continued is I'm always learning. And that's the
Yeah.
great thing. We have so many wonderful colleagues all over the world who are doing the same work, but have different strategies and different challenges. And it's just, we learn things from what everybody is doing and how can you bring a piece of that back to help your community. And I think that's the great thing about our work in drug demand reduction.
Beautiful. No, that's exceptional. And I think one of the things that really spoke to me in that narrative there, that your journey is the vulnerability that creates a level of obviously distress as your parents. And the argument is my brother was in a similar space. He uses drugs. Our family suffer from it. That's kind of the deal. And working in that space, in the shock, and then trying to figure out how to move forward. It's not just about self-preservation, but it is about trying to help the communities grapple with this. But I love the fact that when you stepped into that space, and I think listeners, I want you to catch this. It's not about trying to fix a problem, although that's part of this journey, and it's not about trying to stop a behaviour, although that's part of the journey because the behaviour is creating all sorts of issues. But it's really about understanding what's going on, and I think that awareness and that development of awareness in communities is a powerful thing. And when and unfortunately, some people craft narratives, to suit themselves when it comes to drug normalization. We won't talk about that right now, but this is really, really powerful. This sense of, I want to understand this, so that I can help this person make better life choices, so that they can, not just that we can be happy and our family can be nice and whole and complete and whatever that may look like in your particular demographic, but it's a journey of more than awareness. It is applied awareness, and I love that. And I think for a lot of people listening who are in this boat now, and again, Amy's experienced something that you would not experience, because the level of stigma, the level of options are the level of stigma is a lot lower now. And the options available to transition out of that space are a lot greater, and understanding and awareness is a lot clearer. But it's still important to understand all the factors here. So I just really want to invest in that for a moment, because I think every time in the learning factor that you've just said, we're always learning. This is a teaching and learning moment, guys. And I just wanted to hear that echo from Amy on that. I think that's really important. So thank you for that. I was not aware of that, and that is very helpful. And it also, I think it frames up better the way you conduct yourself and what you do, and as obviously as you move forward. Now, part of that journey, if I'm correct in my understanding, our research, is that you kind of moved into problem-solving courts or drug courts at some stage. Now, I've had the real privilege here in Victoria, literally just up the road from our office is a drug court. And the local magistrate and I spent a lot of time together. I attended the court, journeyed with him, understanding it from the inside and how that works. Brilliant setup. Tell us about your experience in that. What started you there? Obviously, I'm assuming it's kind of a roll-on from what you've just shared. But yeah, how did that work? What was that experience like for you?
So I had a really great mentor when I worked at the treatment center, and she kind of realized that I had gone as far as I could at the treatment center, and it wasn't and this sounds probably a little harsh to say, but some people are made to deal with clients. I am not one of those people. I am more of a behind the scene person. And I think at first I took too much of those people home with me, and every case became very personal. But then I quickly realized that I wasn't giving everybody my full level of compassion, because you kind of, at some point when you're dealing with clients, you start hearing the same story over and over again, and you
There's
don't.
not a lot of variation, is there?
I found myself not giving the 100th person the same compassion that I gave the first person. And then it's time to walk away. It's time to go somewhere else. And so she kind of pushed me to take this position in drug court. And, she said, this would be a great growing experience for you. And I'm going to tell you, I love drug court. I loved working there. I loved hearing the story. I loved seeing the completion of that cycle. Because when I was working in treatment, it was most of the time people came to treatment, even if they came willingly, it was, they did it because they had this outside pressure. And so for the most part, it was kicking and screaming, and they didn't really want to be there, but they knew they needed to be there. And when you sit through a cycle of drug court, you see the kicking and screaming at the beginning, but then the full circle of them being there, sometimes 24 months or longer, completing treatment, graduating from high school, getting a job.
Beautiful.
And sometimes when you're in the audience and you're cheering these people on, it's the first time they've ever had support in their whole entire life. They've never had somebody clap for them. They've never had somebody stand up and acknowledge this milestone. And so you really see the full circle. But what I really liked about it, I'll never forget, this lady was up there, and she at the time was probably 10, 15 years older than myself. She had, she was, I think, like a millionaire at one point in her life.
Wow.
She owned hotels. She owned little apartment complexes around town, and she lost everything. everything. She lost her family, she lost her businesses,
Yeah.
she lost everything. And she was slowly building all that back up. And during the drug court process, she had that reunification with her family and was starting to mend those bridges. And she sat up there, and I just remember this like it was yesterday, that every single one of us are one bad circumstance or one bad choice from being where she was at.
Yeah, brilliant.
And that hit me really hard, because we all have really crappy days, right? And it's what choice do you make to rectify that bad day? And it very could easily be, I decide to pick up the bottle and, make a few drinks. And if I have that, if I decide to do that every day, or if I have that genetic vulnerability that something else, it escalates to something else, something as innocent as, you drove me to drink, how we say those kind of things, like this day was so bad, it drove me to drink. That's just one easy step into what could change the whole trajectory of your life. But the good news was she took another step to make that change. And it might have taken a few years, and by golly, she lost everything, but she had time to recoup it. And she was so joyful and so thankful and just so hopeful that, I'm here every day. Like I'm here for this drug court. I want to be here every single day. Like I can almost do this for free. Like it was just so rewarding to see people come that full circle. And especially coming from the treatment world, where I didn't get to see that because I wasn't involved in that in those other steps. So to see the resources that are available, to be a part of a team that really cares for each defendant as they go through that cycle, really just was an amazing place to be. But I also, this is where I learned to love policy, because this is where I saw that people who wanted to get help, if they weren't involved in the legal system, at least where I'm from, it's almost impossible to get into treatment unless you're a millionaire, unless you have, the bed space is so limited, and it's almost all sponsored by the criminal justice system. So you would have families calling you, begging you to arrest their family member or arrest them so that they could get into the services to get the help that they needed. And one day while I was there was a case that we had to drop because the state attorney, there wasn't enough trace material on the paraphernalia to charge them with possession to keep them in drug court. And this woman was begging to stay into drug court so that she could have these services, and we had to let her go. And I said to the state attorney, well, she's admitting that she used the drugs. Can't we just go with that? And the state attorney says, it's not illegal to use drugs. It's only illegal to possess drugs. And she couldn't stay. And and I said, well, that needs to change. And she said to me, she's like, well, that's a statute. She's like, you can't change the law from the desk you're at right now. And I said, well, I'm going to find the desk that I can change that law.
Good on you.
And it just so happened that later that week, Calvina Fay, my predecessor, called me and asked me to apply for a job with her as her manager of congressional and legislative affairs. And I said, I don't know what that means, but I'll figure it out if it has to do with policy.
Brilliant. That's an outstanding journey. And I look, thank you, Amy. I think that's fantastic. And for the listeners, who've heard that story, I can testify to a lot of the reality of what Amy's speaking about. Obviously, our system's a little bit different, but drug courts didn't eventuate in Australia. They obviously started in the US, I think, on problem-solving courts. And a lot of different iterations of that exist globally. And so I've seen some remarkable ones. The Hawaiian model was quite a successful one as well. But I love that. I love the kicking and screaming dynamic. And one of the issues about substance use, and I'm going to use a very famous quote by a gentleman by the name of Stephen Covey in a moment, but one of the very real realities of this process is that without a coercive mechanism, change for those who are caught in the tyranny of addiction, change isn't really possible. And now I've got to qualify that, because the argument from the pro-drug activists is that that people who are coerced into treatment don't last. Well, we know from the data that there's it's percentage points difference between those who are voluntary enter or those who are coercively introduced to the process. But the bottom line is, once you've got a foreign substance in your system dictating how your biology functions to a great extent, and the decision-making processes that issue from that, you've got a real problem. Unless there's an intervention, and that intervention has to be so specific and severe to ensure that there's a separation from the substance and the person. And this is where I love the legal use. We call it the judicial educator. It's a language we use. We created it about 12 years ago because we kept saying, oh, well, the law doesn't. Hang on, it's an educative tool. Let's use it that way. Let's not use it as a punitive one. But the point is in bringing agency back to that person. I'll get to the point. Agency comes back to that person. Agency has been surrendered to the substance. And then the substance, in a large part, not for everybody, but a large part, it governs. It now governs. It is the master of decision making. Until that master is chained and removed, then the agency of that person cannot be recalibrated and recreated. And so Stephen Covey's famous quote was, in between stimulus and response is the greatest power you have, the power to choose. That's never taken away from you, even with drug use. It's still there. It's just chained and subdued. And so the person needs to be set free from that setting so the agency can reboot. And as you've just beautifully indicated, that wonderful story about that lady, she had a stimulus, a negative one, and then she had a response. In between that was a decision. She chose to enter into the world of drug use. And that the rabbit hole she went down. But getting out of that, the reverse of that journey has brought her to a new place, not only of success and whatever, but she's better, ironically, better as a person as a result of that, and now as an agent for change in her community. And this is where the legislative educator, the judicial educator, is so powerful and so effective. And that's been clear and evident in your journey since you were recruited by Calvino, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, because I think that's really important. But I just want to digress for a moment, because there's a recent advent, which is it's not new, but the potential rescheduling of cannabis, because there's been a long fight against weed in the US, and you've been an integral part of that. And the bad actors have been very clever at dealing with this, and we can go back into the history of how this started. The National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, been around for nearly 40 years. They've been pushing for this agenda. They've been systematically undermining things, and California, we still what's happened. We're not going to go back into the entire narrative behind that, but I think it's important to sort of frame this up a little bit for the next bit, because this rescheduling from Category 1 to Category 3. Now, of course, the Category 1 is the same as heroin and other drugs. And, of course, the bad actors say, oh, marijuana's harmless. It's, the Woodstock weed, We now know from the science this cannabis is shocking on every level, because it's been engineered. The natural plant doesn't exist. Again, I won't, for the sake of our listeners, you can go to our website. You can see all the data. We've written extensively on this. The weed we have today is not a natural plant at all. It's a highly engineered substance, and its capacity to bring harm, mental health harm particularly, is staggering. And its ability to undermine the biological unit is now breathtaking by comparison to 45-year-old weed. So again, that's really important. So this Schedule 1 is probably more relevant today than it's ever been in its history. And, of course, the bad actors talk about the reefer madness, and we now talk about the new reefer madness, which says it's harmless, let's just legalise it. But this rescheduling has been on the table for a long time. The previous administration, the Biden administration, tried to do it. They were slowed down and pushed back against. The current administration, POTUS, Mr. Trump, and he's decided that he might do that. And, of course, behind that scene is a lot of toing and froing. As one of his chief of staff was apparently, I think, involved in the cannabis industry and all that sort of thing. So there is promises made here that are being fulfilled. So again, it's politicians being politicians. We said we'd do this for our mates, and we're going to do it. Now, it's on our side. We love it. We think, yes, wonderful. When it's on their side, we hate it because we think it's corrupt. So let's be fair. It's one of the games that politicians play. I'm not here to justify the behaviour, but that's the reality of politics. You people, they fund you, they support you. There's an expectation of a return on that investment. Anyway, but we know from all our involvement over the years and yours as well, this is a bad decision. It's a bad idea.
Yes.
So I want to kind of we're gonna speak to that in a moment, but I just want to continue on your journey because I want to talk a bit about Calvina. I want to talk a little bit about the Drug Free America Foundation. Now because you were also involved with you've been the executive director since 2018. I remember when that transition happened because we were dealing with Calvina prior to that, which is fantastic.
Yep.
But you're also, I think, are you still serving? You may not be, so correct me if I'm wrong. But you were or are the executive director of the Florida Coalition Alliance, representing multiple. Okay, yeah. So you're still in this space of pushing back against substance use. And so this has been your journey. You've seen the marijuana, particularly the last 12, 15 years. You've been in the very heart of this push, this fresh, aggressive commercialization, this propagandized push to make weed available to everybody, and completely normalise it to the point where it's the same as alcohol and ironically alcohol and tobacco, which everyone's trying to remove from the marketplace. But so that's kind of the idea. So that tenure gives you some serious perspective. Now, what I'd like, if you can, share with our listeners a little bit about the highs and lows of that journey. You talk about policy, some of your wins, but also some of the shocking things that you've experienced. I remember Calvina posting, and I emailed her a couple of times, she was getting death threats earlier from the sector because of her stand against cannabis. So tell us a little bit about that journey and how, when you came into after Calvina left, what was that whole mess like for you, and what were some of the positive things as well?
So I guess the first positive thing would be, we've heard from this industry, since way before I came into this field, and they had very lofty goals, and they're behind schedule. They're behind their schedule on what they wanted to accomplish in a certain time frame. And that's because of, all the pushback from really great organizations around the globe, really, that have been able to educate people and, really work on this.
Yep.
But one of the people who was doing this when nobody else was Calvina.
Yep.
And so she really did get a lot of the initial, she was like, public enemy number one to the legalizers.
Correct.
And she was behind raising the money to defeat these ballot initiatives. In fact, one of our greatest colleagues and friends right now is Kevin Sabet with Smart Approaches to Marijuana.
Beautiful.
And, when Calvina started out, Kevin, was in college and helped, working with Calvina when he was at college and, working on these issues. And so this is how far back this goes. And, her really, I don't think she gets the credit she deserves for pulling so many people into this space.
Today she does.
And giving them the opportunity to start organizations and have this platform to speak on. And she kind of laid her and a few others, David Evans, there was a very small group of people that really helped build this platform that the rest of us are still standing on and still shouting from. And we owe a lot of our successes to that groundwork that they built. And unfortunately, things just haven't changed. It's the same fight that they started 30 years ago that we're still battling. What has changed is, I think, like the brazenness of these organizations that we call the legalizers, right? They have so much money now. Yeah. So when I first started, it was a handful of people. Yeah. It was the George Soros, the Peter Lewis's, it was a few organizations that were raising money.
Yeah.
Yes. And now the industry itself funds its narratives. You have, so I'll give you an example. In Florida last year, we defeated at the ballot box the legalization here. And it was almost 100% funded by the biggest dispensary chain in our state, Trulieve. About 90% of the $150 million that they
That's
spent, which is the
obscene.
most that's ever been spent
Yeah.
on a marijuana ballot initiative. And I'm going to just venture out there, any ballot initiative. And so it was a true David and Goliath victory. And the result of that victory is now criminal investigations into how money was raised and spent on our side, because they are sore losers. And there's not a lot I can get into about that.
I understand.
But it really shows that this industry will stop at nothing to discredit the people that stand up to them, to clear their path to the ballot. And you think, as a normal human being, why would they be doing this? Why do they have this agenda? It's all about money.
Of course.
Can you imagine taking the chance to spend $150 million plus on something and then lose? These are the people who are going to the White House and that are talking to Trump.
Yep.
But the CEO of these companies are the people that are in Trump's ear about this decision that he's now thinking about making. And it really has to do with all of their pocketbooks, because they stand to gain millions of dollars through this rescheduling
Arguably
process.
billions. Amy, billions.
Yeah, billions of dollars that each one of them can make because of the products that they will then be able to sell, on the heels of a victory that came just a couple months ago, where we were able to close this hemp loophole.
Correct.
And, give these products a time to get off the shelf. But now with this looming, this opens that back up again. And, so you have this horrible thing coming, and I think it's going to be one of the worst mistakes that he makes. We know that he does not supportive of this kind of thing. He doesn't drink. He doesn't do drugs.
Absolutely.
He tells his kids not to drink and use drugs. But like you said, promises were made during the campaign. These high-level people that are in his ear, that are part of his administration or his, the powerhouse
Inner
people,
circle.
Yeah, this inner circle, they're all invested in this industry. And the good news is that, I talked about our colleagues at SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana. They are working to reverse legalization in a few states.
Yes, Massachusetts being one of them,
Yeah, so you have this, seesaw here, right? We have, because of these high potency products and the havoc that they've wreaked on our communities, whether it be public health or public safety wise, we've raised the awareness level of what's happening, because you have, unfortunately, all of these parents who have lost children to psychotic breaks.
Yep.
You have parents who have lost children or loved ones to marijuana high drivers.
Correct.
You have violent crimes being committed by people
Horrendous.
who are high on marijuana. So the level of awareness is really raising. So on one hand, you have this momentum to overturn things and to pass new laws and to really educate policymakers. And then as you're making that headway and you feel so good about yourself, up pops the potential executive order to reschedule marijuana. And so it's this constant seesaw that we're on, that we just really can't, for every 3 steps we take in a positive direction, we get punched back a few steps.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I feel like that's how it's been for the last 20 years.
Yeah. No, look, and I followed that as well. That's why I wanted to bring it up, because you're in the mix. You're right in the middle of this, and you've been a key actor in the highs and lows of this since the ferocity ramped up in the last 20 years. But the last 15 particularly, we've seen that ferocity, and that's what it is. And the normalisers, legalisers care little. In fact, they care nothing for communities, because addiction for profit industries exist for one thing. I've just said what they are: addiction for profit. That's it. Mm-hmm. and they will sanitize, they will sacralize if they can. They've even tried that with weed. They will sacralize a substance to try and make it normal, accessible. We just did an expose on a company here that did their financial report, talking about how much success they have, and they said, and our product treats 50 conditions. This is the absolute. This is not just a misinformation. This is patent error. Yeah. And it's like this goes unchecked because with our TGA, which is our version of your FDA, our TGA has given them a loophole. So the products that had to be tested, their testing regime only goes up to half the pyramid of what should be acceptable for quality testing.
Hey, before we continue, we want to highlight an excellent cousin podcast you should definitely check out. Pathways to Prevention with Dave Clausen. Dave brings incredible, proactive and protective insights that really complement the work we're doing here at UHP. That's Pathway number 2, Prevention. Make sure you subscribe and give it a listen. Now, back to UHP.
So again, this is a real concern. Now, I actually read interesting High Times, and I want to High Times, which is a obviously pro weed group. They actually did a pretty good. I'll give them credit for this. A pretty good expose on this potential, what this means, because this, like I said, Biden. We looked at doing this. There's a lot of pushback, as it's happening again now, to reschedule it. And DEA, and according to High Times, and they're pro this, so they're not jumping on the bandwagon and saying it's a new day. Although, for the listeners who are interested in this space, since that announcement came last week, shares in the major weed companies have almost doubled or tripled overnight. So this means this is a very positive thing for them. However, can Trump, just some statements here, can Trump do this without Congress? Yes, but with limits. Under the Controlled Substances Act, rescheduling does not require Congress. The authority sits with the Attorney General, typically delegated to the DEA, with scientific input from Health and Human Services. So those things still have to go into play as well. Trump cannot personally reschedule cannabis with a tweet or executive order, but he can direct the Justice Department to move to process forward and potentially bypass stalled administrative steps. So that's the negative, right? Biden tried that. We know that. Now, what does Schedule 3 mean? This is for those who are listening and they're interested in this space. Schedule 1 drugs are defined as having no acceptable medical use. That's where cannabis still sits alongside heroin. Schedule 3 drugs are recognised as having medical value. Now, this is the tricky there. Now, they have medical value, but remain controlled. Examples include ketamine, anabolic steroids, and certain prescription painkillers. Moving cannabis to Schedule 3 would be a formal federal acknowledgement of the medical use, but it would not legalise cannabis. So that's a really important distinction. Now, Dave Evans, who you mentioned before, we've had him on the program, great guy. We interviewed him, and that's one of our podcasts. And I recommend you listen to Dave on this because he was originally a pro-legaliser, and then he got caught up in this, and he himself became an addict and had to step away. But great story, great insights, and he's a rabid advocate against cannabis legalisation. He's taking legal action and successfully, I might add, in a lot of places, which is great. So really worth listening to that podcast episode. Not a shameless plug, just a genuine. I think it's a great thing to listen to Dave on this. But he even said today, it's interesting, under Schedule 1, GW Pharma, which is now Jazz Pharmaceuticals, managed to get Epidiolex tried and done. So it can be done without shifting it to Schedule 3.
There's several drugs through our FDA system that are cannabinoid based, and
correct.
And what happens then is that particular drug is moved to a different scheduling. So like Epidiolex is not a Schedule 1 drug; it's a Schedule 3 drug. I
correct.
believe.
Yeah, exactly right. So the point is, it's about how it's managed. And so again, this is not sort of a fait accompli, but because of the lax laws, this is the thing about what is determined as medicine. And so if it's going to be Schedule 3, then all of the trials, arguably, this is the thing that I'm bringing to the table, as I understand it, and you're the policy expert, so I'm happy for you to correct me on this. But when you move to Schedule 3, then, okay, this is medicine. Yeah, no, it's not the homegrown medicine. Has this gone through proper double-blind, placebo-accounted for clinical trials? Is it fully vetted through the FDA process and then is registered as Schedule 3? It's like Epidiolex, whatever you want to call it, the name. Yeah. I still remember when they started this about 16 years ago. They started this, but anyway. So that's the only new. Let's be clear to listeners, for those who are not as familiar with this sector as we are. That is the only new pharmaceutical grade. Very important distinction. Pharmaceutical grade medicine from cannabis to come on the market in the last 40 years. All the other stuff that exists was already there. Sativex, Dravenol, and they have no curative powers, no curative restorative powers at all. This particular substance, Epidiolex, was a legitimate version of the illegitimate version of Charlotte's Web, which was dosed up, to try and deal with seizures. Properly vetted, properly synthesized, 13 years and $1.3 billion to get this drug to a pharmaceutical grade. And it does work, but it only has a 25% efficacy. It is a fourth-line treatment. So in other words, there are 3 other treatments for Dravet syndrome epilepsy that are better than this. But it does have a potential to affect a small group of people very well, but under medical supervision, properly supervised, not randomly dispensed by backyard operators at any dose rate you like. So this is, and after all that research, after all the potential for this great cannabinoid plant, this is the best we've been able to come up with in 40 years. And so what they have to do is drop the bar on what is medicine, and that's going to be the concern. Will this moving to Schedule 3 should potentially increase the supervision around what medicines are actually registered and how they're registered and how they're deployed. But this is the problem with the current definition of medicine. What are your thoughts?
And interestingly enough about Epidiolex, it has zero, not even trace amounts,
Correct.
0 amounts of THC. And I spoke to, I can't remember Dr. Guy, from GW Pharmaceuticals, and he said that the reason why that is so important is because in their studies, they found that even a very small amount of THC actually caused seizures on a sensitive brain. And so the problem with the dispensary Charlotte's Web version was that outside of a pharmaceutical setting, you cannot get the trace amounts of THC out.
Correct.
So interestingly enough, there still isn't even THC in the one that got passed.
Correct.
And they're always trying to promote the THC as one of the medical proponents of it. So yeah, I think that, it would regulate the way that we look at these drugs. There would be a little more, but, I always look at what Dr. Bertha Madras says from Harvard Medical, and she says that...
We had her on last time. Yeah, it was great.
Yeah. And, people always say that it's too hard to research. We can't get the research. She says that there are so many research things being done around marijuana, and that the problem is that, you don't hear about them because they don't make it to the end of their research cycle because things fall through. They're not as good as they thought it was going to be. They have worse side effects, and that's what research is. And
Correct.
So people think that because they didn't hear about all the outcomes of these hundreds of different research things, that means it's not happening. It is happening. It's just not going through the full cycle because it really wasn't good enough to work as a medicine.
Perfect. And that's exactly what's happened. And there's something like, and I'm going to miss this now because I haven't got the data in front of me. There's something like over $5 billion, it's billions, has been spent on the very research you've talked about, and thousands of clinical and other trials have been engaged in, have been deployed, and have failed for the very reason you said. This is not delivering what the propagandists told us it would deliver. This is the miracle drug. This is the panacea of all ills. It is not. In fact, it creates more ills than it actually even tries to try and manage. Again, no curative powers at all, no curative properties at all. Even the hardline researchers who are desperately trying to to glean from this, because we can massage this a bit more and maybe get something out of it. They're really saying this is incredibly limited. And we've had, like, again, 50 years of research, 50 years of experimentation, and all we're getting now from this bizarre, it is just bizarre. We call it the new reefer madness. It is just insanity that is now telling people this is medicine, and people feel better, so they think they are better. But the fact is they're getting worse. And we've gone back 150 years to the bad old days in the US where, cocaine and opium were, dispensed at will because people felt better, so therefore I am better. So this insanity has now been perpetuated in this new culture of science.
And let's not forget that that's not what it was about anyways.
No.
This was all about getting their foot in the door so that they could legalize for the real reason they wanted it, and that was recreational. Yeah. And if you doubt that, look who's behind the recreational ballot initiatives. It's the dispensaries. So if they really were in it because they thought it was a medicine and they really thought that they were doing something great for mankind, then why would they also be pushing for recreational use?
Perfect.
Because that's where the money is. That's what their end game is. And it was this whole process to normalize everything, make it invisible. So our other colleague, and as you can tell, I just absorb everything everybody else says. Our other colleague, Carlton Hall, he always says, normalization breeds invisibility. And that's true. So on my way to work, which is just like 3.5 miles down the road, I pass by 6 different dispensaries.
Wow.
Now, those are just dispensaries. I also pass by a few smoke shops who are advertising these products. And I don't even notice them anymore because I see them every single day.
There it is.
And when I was in Washington visiting a friend, she lives 45 minutes, northeast of Seattle. She lives in this little town. And she was driving me around the Pacific Northwest, and I'm seeing dispensary after dispensary after dispensary in these little tiny towns. I didn't see any, and I'm sure they were there. They just weren't on the path that we were on, but the dispensaries were. I didn't see a library. I didn't see any fresh produce stands. I didn't see any playgrounds. They were tucked away. There weren't as many of them. And so I said to her, what do you think the priority of your community is? And she's like, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, how far do you have to drive if you want to get fresh vegetables? And she's like, about 25 minutes.
Wow.
And I said, I know you don't have any kids anymore that play at a playground, but if you wanted to take them to a park outside of the woods that we're surrounded by, but like a recreational center or a library, she's like 35 minutes at least. And I said, do you realize we've passed like 5 dispensaries in the last 20 minutes?
Wow.
That priority of your community is marijuana, not kids, not food, not libraries, not education. It's marijuana. And she's like, I never thought about it that way. I'm like, yeah, like
perfect.
That's what you've put out there. That's what's on your road. And I think that that's what we've allowed to happen. We have to fight for funding for after school activities. We have to fight for funding for healthcare for people who can't afford it. We have to fight for all of these things that a lot of us take for granted, that we have these, that we're privileged enough to have these resources to have, like safe places to play if you're a kid. But these dispensaries are just popping up everywhere. And, they do try to, you talked about how they try to clean their money.
Yeah.
And we've noticed here by us that they try to donate to a whole bunch of different community events because they want to put their pop-up tent there.
Correct.
And so they've even tried to do it to us. Like I guess they think we just don't have a brain.
Yep.
Yeah. And they're, can we come to your prevention summit? No, you can't. And they're like, well, we'll sponsor it for $10,000. Not a chance.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. But they do it for like, if it's a community, like a back to school fair or a community fair, these people haven't seen a $10,000 sponsorship before. So a dispensary rolls in and says, we'll give you $10,000 and we just want to set up our table here. And they let them do it.
Correct.
And so the next thing you know, here you are at a back to school fair or, the Saturday morning market, and you're walking by the dispensaries table and they have specials and they have, I haven't seen them give out samples, but they're
No.
giving out coupons. They have back to school specials. They have
Wow.
Labor Day specials, holiday specials. Do we allow other drugs to do that?
Yeah,
Like,
correct.
I mean, we don't allow the pharmaceutical industry to come set up pop-up tents
Even
and
alcohol
give out samples and
in a
give
lot of
out
places.
coupons.
Yeah,
No, we don't allow that. But for
correct.
some reason,
In community
marijuana gets a
places.
pass. Like
Yeah.
they get to do that.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, it is. But again, I want to labor this point because this is the new reefer madness. These people are just, weed blind. It's scary. And there is no avenue they will not pursue. Addiction for profit dictates both of those factors, both of those elements are self-fueling. You have addiction that fuels the profit, and the profit that fuels the addiction, and so this cancerous loop, it just drives insanity. And I'm labouring that for a reason. People listening, I'm labouring that for a reason because we need to call this out for what it is. We're trying to push back against booze and nicotine because of what they've done, and at the same time, we're throwing this other, significantly worse in a lot of situations, much worse than the other two combined. Particularly if you smoke your weed, it's really concerning that this is happening, and we don't want this in Australia. Now, one of the reasons I like getting you on, Amy, and others like yourself, is that the experiment that the US has entered into has shown the world how bad this is. Canada has kind of stepped into into bizarre space because we understand how they think they're a bit loony over there anyway. But we still remember when Trudeau introduced that and said we're going to do this. The then President of Holland, of the Netherlands, was there, and he's on public record in the local newspaper. This is a mistake. This is a mistake, Mr. Trudeau. Do not do this. So again, leverage and whatnot is really, really powerful, and the bad actors are getting this. But again, grassroots, public opinion now are starting to see the consequences of this experiment, the harms being done to communities and families. And again, people are popping up all over the place. This is unacceptable. And of course, we need more, and sadly, we need to see more and more high-profile people who have this impact their lives, because a lot of them, as you said, they can afford as the Richard Bransons of this world, they can afford their $1 million a day, $1 million a week recovery sector. They can go off and get well. But the average Joe ends up just spiraling into a shocking place, as you've experienced your entire career. So we want to prevent that. And anyone who's interested in public health, let alone individual and community health, public health cannot look past this mess and go, oh well, it's manageable. Harm reduction can't touch this. Harm reduction cannot touch this. It is not a feasible option.
I think that the opioid crisis really put that into perspective. And, I think that, they try to separate the two, and you can't. It's not an opioid crisis. I mean, I know that that's what we call it, and we get the headlines for that, but it's a drug crisis. It's all these different drugs. And if we only concentrate on one, we're never going to get anywhere with this. But it's really interesting when we look at the marijuana issue, how the same people who want to throw money at the opioid crisis, a lot of times they are saying that they want to legalize marijuana. And and I've had personal friends, I've had family members, I've had people say this to me, and they're like, oh, well, they're two totally different drugs. And I'm like, yeah, they are two totally different drugs, but they're both drugs.
Yeah.
And we have research that says that, marijuana use primes the brain for opioid addiction.
Correct.
And that people who abuse marijuana are 35 times more likely than their non-using peers to also abuse opioids. And so as much as we hate that gateway theory, the reality is that this is the progression. And if and that's why I love to hear from the recovery community on this, because you never hear anybody in recovery saying, oh yeah, let's go ahead and legalize that benign drug, the safer of the drugs. They know that all of this is a very slippery slope, and they they're the ones who are our best advocates for closing these loopholes, who, can talk to policymakers and say, and on the whole harm reduction thing, I remember listening to somebody speak. I was at a panel, and it was a gentleman who, had gone through the whole cycle of addiction, was in jail, stole from his parents, and was in recovery, and was speaking to us. And somebody in the crowd who was pro-drug and very pro-harm reduction, the very, severe harm reduction strategies,
Yeah.
asked a question trying to move the conversation toward those policies.
Of course.
Saying, what could we have done as a community to help you get here faster? Did you need a safe space to use your drugs?
There it
Did
is.
you need, and the look on this gentleman's face, I wish I had my camera, because he looked like, oh my gosh, have I stepped into the twilight zone? And he said, I can tell you what would have accelerated my movement. Stop babying me and giving me so many chances. He's like, I know that I was given those chances out of love. I know my parents wanted to, not kick me out of the house the first 3 times I robbed from them. But had they kicked me out the first time, had that officer arrested me the first time when he caught me with drugs, instead of letting me off. And I know that they did that out of a place of love and out of a place of, trying to make things better for me. But the reality is, the more chances I was given, the more I was able to use drugs.
Correct.
And if somebody would have taken that hard line with me and showed me that this isn't going to end well a little bit faster, I might have gotten to where I am now a couple years early.
Yeah, beautiful.
And that wasn't the answer this chick was looking for.
No. She stepped right into that one. She led with the chin.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're right. The recovery sector is a key issue. The recovery alumni we work closely with for that very reason, not just to inform policy, but to be educators in the community, not tell horror stories, but to be very informed, lived experienced, and hard-earned resiliency-based educators that are equipped with the right knowledge, right understanding, and are able to be authentic knowledge holders and deliver that to the community. Yeah. And it's interesting, that journey that gentleman you just talked about, that's my brother. Mm-hmm. That's my brother. That's exactly what happened to him. Lots of grace, lots of 3rd, 4th, 5th chances. Now, you'll not know this person's name, and I haven't got it in front of me, and I hate not remembering this. She's Cook County DA, African-American woman. She's probably retired now. It was going years ago, but she was a middle-class, drug user, a happy life. She said to the gentleman who finally arrested her because she was abusing her children, she said, crystal meth told me my children were goods to sell, basically. And she said she called these guys who arrested her angels in handcuffs. Sorry, angels with handcuffs. And she'd wished that had happened. I cannot remember her name. Brilliant. She started a kind of an NGO as well, but she worked for Cook County in Chicago. But in Illinois, sorry. So it's, this is the intervention that we need. And this is where drug courts work beautifully, not as a punitive exercise. This is restorative justice. We're actually going to restore your family, restore you, restore your agency, restore your capacity to be a contributor to society, but more importantly, thrive and help your community thrive. Yeah. And everything you just talked about, particularly in the cannabis space, the industry, is about taking that thriving capacity, the thriving oxygen out of communities. You saw it yourself. Playgrounds disappear. Fresh produce disappears. Things that make life well and whole and complete evaporate because substance use becomes the center of the culture. And this is just horrendous. And any public health aficionado who's got any worth their salt looks at this and goes, well, this is a no-brainer. We're not going to do this. And despite the havoc and the noise, and again, it's interesting that the same president that, potentially is going to step into this mistake is blowing up boats in the Caribbean, which, you got these two extremes. And as a result of those hard hammer actions, the amount of pure fentanyl getting in your country is dropping precipitously. So we know these things work.
Yeah, we're all about securing our borders. We're all about taking the hard line when it comes to these cartels, as we should be. Um, and then, this is just kind of an about face to all of that. And it's putting a pretty picture, a pretty face on really the same thing. And because it's a storefront, and because it's a dispensary, and because it's these cute little packaged products, it's different than the substances coming over from Venezuela in a boat. And it's the same thing. It all leads to the same path.
Correct.
And that's the part that I think that, he's really missing the bigger picture in. But it's, that's a hard conversation to have with people who are making billions of dollars off of this industry. And, but he's the kind of guy who has those hard conversations. He's the kind of guy who changes his mind like this. So, if anybody can say, hey, I looked at this and I decided to change my mind, this is the guy who can do it. And so hopefully that's what happens. But I don't have a lot of faith in it right now. No. But I think we just have to keep the course and keep educating and really keep talking about it. And, if it happens, it can be reversed. We just got to figure out a way to do it and keep up that constant stream of education. Yeah,
I think that's an important statement to make, because things do change. And you're right. We watched. If anything about the current president is that what you see is what you get, pretty much. There's not a lot of nuance to the man. So you see him coming a mile away. So it's not like he sneaks up, and like some of your previous incumbents have been very slippery snakes in the grass. But but it's interesting though. You haven't done this, and I'm bringing this into the conversation. The cartel dynamic. Cartels are businesses, and they are multi-level global conglomerate businesses. They are behind so much of the money that's in these dispensaries anyway. We now know, certainly from Colorado's experience, the cartels come in to legitimize their operations, and they are making just as much money. And so it's the irony of this is, and the cognitive dissonance of this is, let's blow up the cocaine in the Bahamas, but let's empower the cartels through dispensaries. Now, if that was clearly and patently posited to the current administration with the evidence that's clear, surely that's going to have some weight and some bearing on the decision, despite the fact that you have your corporates, the legitimate corporates, that your big tobacco that are 2.0 that have come in behind this and gone, hey, we're losing our race on tobacco in the West, although they're making billions in the developing world. Yeah. That's another story. But let's create this new industry. So I think the cartel activities is still incestuously and inextricably part of this whole process.
Absolutely. And I don't remember the exact data or how this went down. I just remember the conversation when Colorado legalized marijuana. I remember hearing from the folks that worked at the height of the high intensity drug area, trafficking, whatever it's called.
Yeah, good. Well done.
And they had explained to me that cartels had never operated on U.S. soil, and that they had a go-between. So like the cartel was over here in Mexico or another country, and then they worked with people in the U.S. that were affiliated, maybe through gangs or things like that, but it wasn't like the legit cartel. And that when Colorado legalized marijuana, it was the first time that they saw cartels actually operating on U.S. soil.
There it is.
And it wasn't just the Mexican cartels. I think that they had like the Chinese cartels.
Correct.
There was like Asian cartels.
Vietnamese cartels. Yep, they were all there.
Cartels.
They were all there. Yep.
Yeah, and so to me that, and these aren't people who go away because you legalize or reschedule marijuana.
Correct.
They.
I'm going to stop being a bad guy now. Oh, it's legal. Let's be good guys.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm going to give up my trafficking and firearms and human beings and fentanyl and all the other things that we're doing. And I think that there was an article years and years ago that talked about how there could be a really good argument made that when the U.S. legalized marijuana, it's what lit the fire under cartels to really put their money and their strategies behind opioids because they were losing so much money. I mean, if there's one thing that we do good in the U.S., it's we like to do things better than whoever was doing them first, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we were getting all of our marijuana from Mexico and South America. And now that we can grow it here, we have figured out how to grow better marijuana. It's more potent. We grow it, we manipulate the growth cycle. We grow all year long. We have
Correct.
indoor growing. And
Correct.
so we don't have the need to get that from out of our
Yeah,
own
yeah.
country
Yeah,
now.
correct.
And so do you think that those cartels just folded up camp? No. And so this article was saying that that's what drove them to really invest and get into fentanyl and the opioids because of the money that they lost through the legalization of marijuana in the US. And it makes sense.
Yep. Yep, which is another wonderful argument against legalization, because that's,
Yeah.
this is fantastic conversation, and our listeners are getting you're listening today, guys. You're getting a first-hand insight from someone who's been actively involved in this whole journey, and I want to again reiterate that this is Amy's participation here is from grassroots right through to global space. And on that context, we're running out of space here, but I'm really enjoying this conversation, Amy. Thank you for this. You were voted in. I remember you were voted into your current role with World Federation Against Drugs, which is fantastic. That was, I think, in Sweden. Oh, goodness me. It must have been about 7 years ago, 8 years ago.
I think so.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They keep
But look,
voting me in.
yeah, and obviously you've seen that, like, as we just talked about, you've seen the metastasizing of the various things that have, particularly in the cannabis space. But being in that global position, and obviously not just talking about the US and cannabis, obviously cannabis and opioids and the fentanyl crisis, and that's obviously horrendous and shocking and globally recognised and awful. But from a global perspective, just quickly, what are some of the positive and some of the negative things you're seeing in your role as the president of the World Federation Against Drugs, from a policy perspective, at least, anyway?
Well, I think for the negative part, you really do see how these industries for profit, like you've said, really take advantage of countries that don't have the resources that we have. And we look at what's happened in the US and the blows, the significant impacts to public health and public safety that marijuana legalization has brought to us. And now you think about that in some of our Asian countries or our countries in Africa who don't have the infrastructure that we have in the US, that don't have the resources that we have in the US. And you think, as they're looking at these policies, what is the devastation going to be? Because we have a lot of resources. We have a lot, as much as many of the horrible impacts that marijuana legalization has in the US, it is fairly regulated when it comes to how we put all these roadblocks, if you will, in place, but they still have such significant damage associated with them. They're not going to have those same kind of roadblocks.
Correct.
And they're not going to have those same kind of resources to deal with the fallout. And so if we're struggling with them, imagine what's going to happen to these countries that aren't as well off when it comes to those principles. And they're following in our footsteps. They're like, oh, well, they're doing it in the US and it's making them this money. So, we're leading them down this path.
Yeah.
And it's very frightening. So I think that's been, what I see as the biggest negative impact, especially coming from the US. And, sometimes it's very heartbreaking almost to be looked at as, well, I have people on a webinar and they say, well, if your president and your country sees all of these negative impacts, why do they continue down that path? And I'm like, yeah. Good question. I can't answer it.
Yeah.
That, I don't have an answer for you. So that's really the negative part.
Yeah.
The positive part that I see is, with all of the struggles that we have around the globe, I think that people really do connect, and I didn't see this 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I think that people are finally really making the connection that substance use has to national security, to the family dynamics,
Perfect.
to community safety and public health. It really was kind of this standalone issue that we're not going to talk about, and we're going to complain about how it impacts everything, but we're not really going to put any strategies in place to lessen the amount of children that are entering the foster care system because they have parents who are abusing
Kin care,
drugs.
yeah, it's
When
shocking,
you
isn't it?
make, yeah, when you can make those connections, how then can you put strategies in place to lessen those impacts? So you see countries looking at substance use and sustainable development goals, and how are those two things working against each other, or how can they work toward each other when
Yeah.
we're talking about
Beautiful.
investing in treatment, investing in recovery, investing in prevention. And so that's the positive things I've seen. And I think that unfortunately it took the opioid crisis to really, and the fentanyl and these synthetic drugs to really open those conversations and really shed light on a lot of those problems. I don't think we're always going to have our work cut out for us. I think that, there's always going to be more work to do. But I see headway that's being made. You can't help but feel this sense of hope and this sense of joy when you see a project like our friend Diana's in India and the Fourth Wave Foundation and the
Beautiful.
impact that they're having, building that resilient generation of youth who are so focused on all of the positive things that they bring. And to have that happening in a country whose makeup of the population is so much youth.
Yes, yes, it is.
And I don't remember what Diana said the statistics were, but they have, their biggest percentage of the age bracket is young people.
Yes, it is.
So when you have these young people stepping up to become leaders, to show that you can do all these things and have a drug-free lifestyle, and that's something to be proud of. I think that really, that's what helps me sleep better at night.
Yeah,
That's
beautiful.
what makes me want to continue in this field. And you have, our friends in Singapore who have some of the toughest laws there are on the books when it comes to drug possession and things like that, but they're still focusing on prevention.
Yes.
And I went there and I toured some of their treatment facilities, and they had, 8 people in there. And I was like, where is everybody? They're like, what do you mean? There's
Exactly.
8 people here.
Yep.
This is almost a full house.
Yes.
But the fact that they are still super hyper focused on helping those 8 people.
Yeah.
And, here in the US, there'd be a waiting list for that. There'd be 200 people on a waiting list to get into that facility, and the beds would be packed. But the fact that they're still making it a number one priority.
Yeah, beautiful.
When it's such a small bit of the population, that's just so inspiring that, they're seeing that, even though we only have this small percentage of our population that is initiated into drug use, we're going to concentrate a lot of effort on them because they're meaningful. Their life means something, and we want them to be reconnected with their family, and we want them to have a place in society. Like, those things make it just so inspiring to move forward in this. So I think, like, you can look at a country like Singapore, who's probably very, and I'm not up on how much money they have, but I'm going to venture to say they're a rich country, and they're still investing in people. And then you look at places in India who don't have all of those resources, and they're still investing in their youth and making those differences. those are the winning strategies. Those are the successes that we have and that we have to learn from and build on with each other. So that's the cool part of our jobs, right?
Yeah, brilliant. No, that's awesome. And I'm aware of both of those settings. And yeah, for those who are not initiated in this space, if they do hear about Singapore, they hear about the severity of their drug laws. But it's the severity of their drug laws that embrace the entire community. That's why the funnel going into the drug sector is so small. That's why the bottom end is so small, because people aren't using, they're not taking up, and because their prevention is so powerful. Their judicial educator is austere. It is austere, but they worked incredibly hard, as you've just said. I think that's a really good point that for our listeners to get a hold of. They work incredibly hard to bring about restoration. This is not a punitive mechanism. It's a restorative one. And, of course, what Diana's doing and the Fourth Wave, we work closely with them, and they're just doing an outstanding, stellar job. And as are you, Amy. You're fantastic. Before we close, and we've gone 15 minutes over, which means that this was a good interview. Thank you for that. Good on you. We ask nearly all our guests this question: the fence or the ambulance? Fence at the top of the cliff or the ambulance at the bottom? Which one is better, or both necessary?
I think you have to have both. There's always going to be somebody that climbs that fence or that, doesn't make it up there. So I think both are equally as important. I think that when we get in trouble is when we prioritize one over the other. And I think that that's what happened with harm reduction a lot of times is, some of the harm reduction policies are actually good policies, and they fit within that continuum of care. But if you're only investing in the one thing and you're not investing in prevention, treatment, recovery, everything throughout that continuum, you're never going to solve these problems.
Perfect.
You have to have that. And I'm a preventionist at heart, and I truly believe that if you invest more on the front end,
absolutely,
you don't have to spend all that down there. So I think that when we are going to invest our resources unevenly, we should err on the side of prevention and really double down there, because then you don't have to spend the money on the Band-Aids and everything else. But we're a long way off from that. And we have so many people that are in the middle that need that triage. And, we have to keep them through that continuum of care and invest in all of it.
Perfect. And I think that's where the build the stronger fences, and that the policies don't interfere with each other and actually undermine the misuse of harm reduction. We have as part of our harm minimisation platform in Australia, the misuse and the hijacking of harm reduction, which is a genuine mechanism. Again, I'll repeat this for our listeners: a genuine mechanism to help people stay alive whilst they exit drug use. The continuum of care mechanism, the continuum of care process is the key. We want people not to enter drug use, and if they do, we want them to exit drug use. And the distance between those two ends gets smaller and smaller. Mm-hmm. What happens when harm reduction is hijacked by pro-drug actors is they use those mechanisms to normalise drug use, keep people using drugs, and continue to drive more and more ambulances, which have to do constant triage, because we've said this is a lifestyle you can actually function in, which it is not. And so therefore harm reduction becomes an adversary to prevention. And that's why we are saying, hey, let's work these wonderful mechanisms together to deny uptake, or delay it, and then as quickly as possible exit people from substance use. Amy Ronshausen, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really good. It was really good. And sorry about the impromptu conversation about the rescheduling, because it did land in the last couple of days. I thought it's worth talking about with you there. So thanks for joining us, and we're looking forward to this podcast going out and a lot of reactions and bits and pieces. Again, for those listening to us, thank you for joining us today. And as always, continue to be a proactive agent of change in your community, and to avoid at all costs the unnecessary harm that so many people want to perpetrate in our society. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, be safe and be well. Bye for now.
As we wrap up today's session, remember, each step towards understanding is a step away from unnecessary harm. We're here to empower, inspire, and pave the way for optimal well-being. Stay resilient, stay informed, and continue being the change your community needs. Thank you for joining us at the Unnecessary Harm Podcast. Until next time, take care and keep pushing forward.